All right, Shane, welcome to SICE Threat Thursdays. You want to go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and MITRE?
Sure. So my name is Shane Patterson. I'm relatively new to MITRE. I have a background in red teaming. I worked for one of the DoD red teams. Prior to that, I did some incident handling work. So I think it's safe to say my background is predominantly incident handling, a little bit of threat intelligence, but mostly red teaming. So now I work for MITRE. I've been doing most of my work for MITRE Engenuity. Engenuity is a tech foundation that brings industry together to work on problems for the public good. So MITRE has Engenuity has several specific centers. They work in health, they work in transportation. I work in the cyber center, the Center for Threat Informed Defense. So CTID, as we call it, the mission is to increase knowledge of the adversary and encourage threat informed defense. So in that vein, we've recently released an adversary emulation library. So as of today, we released 3 plans. The first one is Fin6. The second one, we actually repurposed the evaluations team's APT29 plan, and that's been released in our format. And most recently, we released menuPass or APT10.
Oh, and that's what we're here to talk about. So menuPass, this is a threat actor. The Center for Threat Informed Defense has a lot of interested parties and across multiple industries. What made you pick menuPass as a threat that was such a problem that we were like, we should build a emulation plan that we can release to everybody, which is awesome. And sort of put that out there. What was the driver for that?
So there's a few criteria. The first of which is it was of interest to us and to our participants and our partners. But beyond that, we want to make sure it's relevant to the largest possible audience. menuPass, I think they had been associated with breaches in at least 12 different countries. They've targeted everything from healthcare to manufacturing, oil and gas. Just a very, very broad target set. So we wanted a plan that was applicable to all. They also needed to introduce a degree of novelty. So with our first plan, Fin6 was a cybercrime actor. They were criminally motivated. So they were maybe not funded or resourced to the degree that menuPass or nation state actor would be. But they were very pragmatic, and that pragmatism made them successful. So they use publicly available tools, things like Metasploit, et cetera, to get in. So this is our first actual suspected state-sponsored actor. So we wanted to ensure that the plan that we introduced, this latest plan, introduced something new, and we also wanted to make sure that we released a plan that was fairly recent. So they had to be relevant, they had to be recent, they had to be active within the last few years. And granted, menuPass has been silent for some time. There were two big areas of reporting. One was the Operation Cloud Hopper, the managed service provider stuff, and then there was some reporting around their activity against Japanese institutions. But just recently, that some reporting has picked back up, and I'm always very skeptical of attribution, but it's starting to pick back up. At least it appears to be picking back up with menuPass.
So reading through the Engenuity's blog that released, it seemed that there was extensive reporting on menuPass over the past decade, talking about, I think it was, 32 or 42 different cited cyber threat intelligence reports. Can you go a little bit into sort of how you all go through these, pick techniques that you think are relevant to an adversary emulation plan, and then sort of putting that into a comprehensive plan?
Sure. So manually, we collected it manually. We do a call for papers. We see if any of our participants have access to anything we can't get. but all 32 sources were pulled from the internet. They're all publicly available, open source. We comb through those documents. We get to know menuPass as well as we can. And we try to identify trends. And it was easy with menuPass. Most of those 32 sources can be put into one or two buckets. The first of which being the managed service provider stuff. So they would target managed service providers. They would compromise them, usually spear phishing. And then they would pivot into their actual victims by abusing that trusted relationship. The second bucket would be, could be called everything else, right? It was usually, more often than not, spear phishing that targeted Japanese institutions and entities. And what's interesting is, at least tradecraft wise, it appeared as if they put a little bit more effort into their targeting of the Japanese institutions, whereas with the earlier stuff, the cloud service stuff, they really stressed on that initial access, and their tradecraft was perhaps not as tight. They would do things like just drop tool sets to disk and use well-known tools, but it was successful. So manually, in a long way of saying, we manually went through and read and reviewed all 32 sources.
So you sort of bin things in two buckets. And so this leads into my next sort of talking point with the emulation plan, is that you release sort of a multi-day or a two-phased approach based on those buckets. Am I right?
Yep. Yeah, it's exactly right. So that's how we defined our scenarios. So scenario one was the managed service provider style compromise that I described, and scenario two was the more targeted, leveraging a command and control framework to compromise an environment, achieve your objectives, and then either simulate exfil or actually exfil data.
So when you're going through all that, just the sheer amount of data that's in those threat intelligence reports, what are some trade-offs that you have to make when you're distilling that down into an emulation plan? Are there certain techniques that didn't make it into the plan? And why did you make some of those choices?
Sure. So we really want to emulate the common core of activity we've seen. I mean, at the end of the day, these are human actors. So, there's no one absolute right way to emulate these guys. They, again, like, I'm sure they took a pragmatic approach. They had an objective and perhaps a playbook, maybe some custom tools. But the ultimate objective was to get from point A to point B, not necessarily play by play. This is how you have to get there. So what we tried to do is identify TTPs that were used across different operations that would represent the core of their activity. Beyond that, we discussed earlier a little bit, there's some risk management built in. So some of these guys, menuPass specifically, had used, at least at one point, they'd used web shells to ensure persistence from the outside. So that's something we elected not to include, just because sanitization can be a challenge, right? Especially if you have maybe a team using these emulation plans that aren't necessarily as experienced. So to inject a web shell, it could introduce vulnerability to the network. So that's the kind of thing we think about and build into these plans to ensure we're not introducing risk.
Yeah, some expertise going into building these plans, that a little bit of behind the scenes. So what are some things that that people can do in order to work on protecting or detecting the types of actions and behaviors that menuPass has typically done in these emulation plans? What are defensive teams going to be looking for if they're trying to ensure that they're protected?
So application whitelisting, host intrusion prevention, tiered Active Directory, all the standard stuff. They need to defend in depth and in layers. You need to ensure visibility into all these tools. You need to be able to identify signal and the noise. So all the standard stuff, all the buzzwords I'm using, but really what we're pushing for is threat informed defense, because even if you have all these tools, how do you know they're functioning correctly? How do you know they're feeding into the sim and you're seeing the data you need to see? Um, and really what we want to do by encouraging threat informed defense, we want to lower the bar to entry, ensure that the common mid-level analyst can pick up our plans, run through them, emulate, and thereby determine how successful they are in their environment, protecting and defending against adversaries like menuPass. So
Fair enough. Is there any preview on what the next emulation plan that you're working on, or can't say?
I'm sworn to secrecy. I can tell you this. So it'll be sort of meet those same criteria we talked about earlier. It'll be somebody recently reported, fairly recently, relevant, broad to applicable target audience, and there'll be a degree of novelty, something new that you haven't seen with Fin 6, APT 29, or menuPass. So
Awesome.
more to
Shane,
follow.
yeah, thanks for coming on today and sharing your expertise, and look forward to having you back on again sometime in the future.
Likewise. Thanks, Tim. Thanks for having me.
All right, thanks.